Good morning. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the closing plenary of the 2024 Hancock Symposium. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nate Leonard. I teach in the English department, and it is my great pleasure to be here today to introduce Dr. Kristin Schwain, who is professor of art history in the School of Visual Studies at the University of Missouri, right down the road. Her research focuses on a pluralistic, interdisciplinary exploration of the visual culture of marginalized groups in American culture. Schwain's research looks at visual art in its broadest sense and uses fine art, handcrafts, and mass-produced material culture as tools for interrogating lived experience. She has a vast myriad of publications and curated exhibitions. Her most recent book is a co-edited collection called Handmade in Cuba, Rolando Estevez and the Beautiful Books of, I'm going to massacre this, Ediciones Vigia, which includes her essay Vigia de Legua, Crossing the Dwelling in Basquitos del San Juan. Her most recent exhibition, it was a co-curated exhibition called Rooted, Revived, and Reinvented, Basketry in America, which toured 9 different museums between 2017 and 2019. Her plenary today is called Placemaking, the Missouri Heart of the Nation Art Collection, and I would like to invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Kristin Schwain.
Thank you, Nate. I would be remiss if I didn't add that I'm a little relieved since he has seen me play the card game Crimes Against Humanity. The kids version, which if any of you ever have seen it, it doesn't show me at my best. So I'm very appreciative of his kind words, and I want to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event and to all of you for your hospitality and generosity. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor to be here. I want to say at the outset that my presentation considers the visual culture of Missouri in the 1940s, and it reflects the biases, the stereotypes, and the racism of the era. So I'll be using contemporary language unless I am quoting something from the historical past. And some of the images you're going to find problematic, to say the least. And if you'd like to ask me at the end why I think it's still critical we look at them, I would be happy to address that question because I think of that quite often. Okay. In 1946, one of the few remaining great emporiums, the Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney department store in St. Louis, commissioned 14 modern artists to, in the words of its president, Frank Mayfield, depict through the medium of American art the natural beauties, industrial activities, and cultural characteristics of the estate. The 98 paintings and drawings featured familiar scenes of rural and urban life, of agriculture and industry, of leisure and labor, of production and consumption, and folk life and mass entertainment. The resulting chronicle of contemporary Missouri life was intended to serve both civic and commercial aspirations. Mayfield stressed that the collection, and I'm quoting him here, sought to depict for Missouri and the rest of the world the charm, the strength, the beauty, the way of life of our Midwestern Missouri of today. And secondly, it sought to identify with all these things a commercial enterprise which we believe during its 97 years has become an integral part of it all. The paintings toured the state, graced the pages of the catalog, and appeared on calendars and other print ephemera and educational materials. And here I'm showing you 2 advertisements that included the artworks. the original catalog, and educational materials that featured the paintings. There are myriad ways to contextualize and interpret the Missouri Heart of the Nation collection. Today, I want to think about its role in placemaking, a term associated with the planning, design, and management of public spaces through community-based engagement. It might be more appropriate for me to say that the collection cultivates a sense of place, a concept used by scholars of the built environment and human geography to reference the emotive bonds and attachments people develop or experience in particular locations, the distinctiveness or unique character of particular localities and regions, and or the positive bonds of comfort, safety, and well-being engendered by place, home, and dwelling. This collection does evoke a sense of place, but it also reinforced and naturalized that image. And this morning, I want to activate the collection. I want to underscore its cultural work. I will argue that Missouri's cultural elite carefully curated the Missouri Heart of the Nation collection to assert that the state's varied topographies and industries, its history of European American immigration, and its centrality to Western settlement made it quintessentially American. They drew on a well-established visual culture that viewers, both local and national, would have known through New Deal publications, mass market magazines, picture postcards, tourist ephemera, and documentary photographs. In this way, the collection affirmed a way of seeing, a way of looking at the world that confirmed the beliefs and values of its primarily white middle-class audience. In the end, we'll be in a position to ask whether these paintings are about placemaking or place guarding, a term evoked by critics of placemaking to question its often invisible agenda. In 1946, the entrepreneur Reese Lowenthal asked Mayfield if Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney would be interested in sponsoring a project that would celebrate Missouri life and culture through works of fine art. Lowenthal's reputation for merging culture and commerce preceding him. Over a decade earlier, Lowenthal recognized that traditional art patronage models were not sufficient to support artists and were limiting fine arts audience. So he sought to diversify arts patronage structure and expand its viewing public by integrating the worlds of art and business. And so in 1934, he formed the American Associated Artists, which, as art historian Erica Doss has written, linked consumer culture with the culture industry through an efficient, profit-oriented system of production and distribution. Lowenthal hired nationally known artists to produce original etchings and lithographs and marketed them to middle-class audiences, first through department stores and later directly to the consumers themselves through mail-order catalogs. And on the left is a 1938 advertisement for the American Associated Artists, and on the right are two works sold by it, Thomas Hart Benton's Farmer's Daughter, which is not all that dissimilar to the painting in the Churchill Museum downstairs that was given to Churchill. I obviously was very insightful when putting this together. And Aaron Borod's Reflections in a Shop Window. Lowenthal's program was wildly successful. It went from a $30,000 loss in 1934 to a $50,000 profit in 1935. And by 1937, customers had purchased over 70,000 prints. Mayfield enthusiastically embraced Lowenthal's proposal. Indeed, the marriage between the department store president and the art entrepreneur was ideal. Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney was a department store in the traditional sense of grand emporiums. It was large in size, sold a variety of goods, and was located in an urban area. In 1940, it occupied 8 floors of the Syndicated Trust Building and 7 floors of the Century Building. It had 12 acres of space in the main store and 1,500 employees selling 400,000 items in 150 departments. Since their rise in the late 19th century, Grand Emporiums had worked alongside other modern institutions like museums, public parks, zoos, and World's Fairs to socialize consumers into middle-class values and standards of deportment. Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney was no different. Look at this 1940 home decorating brochure, which seeks to, quote, coordinate your ideas with the standard of quality and good taste. And in other words, this was the vision of Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney, because you see its motto, since 1859, the standard of quality and good taste. Thankfully, the store provided customers with the guidance, the products, and the financing to bring their and Scruggs' vision to life. With its sponsorship of the Missouri Heart of the Nation project, the department store sought to confirm its status as the arbiter of taste and pillar of the community. And in doing so, it worked to distance itself from chain store competitors like Woolworths and Sears Roebuck. These competing forms of distribution embraced self-selecting merchandise that gave consumers direct access to goods, thereby increasing the customer's independence and eliminating the need for qualified sales personnel. Industry leaders debated whether the Grand Emporium should uphold tradition and remain a bastion of elegance, individuality, and personal service. And if you note in the top right-hand corner, you see the first salon, which had been newly redecorated by Scruggs in 1946. Or should they transform its merchandising method, adapting ones used by chain stores to streamline operations and to pare costs? And that one you can see on the bottom right. So I think you can really visualize there two very different responses or processes to sell goods. The Associated American Artists and Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney partnership gained increased visibility with the political ascendancy of Harry S. Truman, which put the state in the national and the international spotlight. Truman, Franklin D. Roosevelt's third vice president, assumed the presidency when FDR died in office in April 1945. 3 months later, Fortune magazine published this portrait of Missouri to its readers to acquaint them with the culture that shaped the folksy president and his trusted advisors. The editorial linked the history and character of Missouri to Truman's presidency and America's future. It encouraged Trump to balance the cool, wise skepticism of the proverbial Missourian with the audacity and building spirit of the state's other famous politician, Senator Thomas Hart Benton. So for the project, Lowenthal selected his best-selling artists to represent subject matter selected by Mary Gamble, Vandervoort's publicity director. And she likely consulted with an advisory board that included Perry Rathbone, the director of the City Art Museum of St. Louis, Paul Gardner, director of the William Rockhill Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, and Charles von Ravensway, director of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis. Importantly, they selected the same regions, industries, and themes that permeated local and national publications of the state. A few comparisons show the degree to which the Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney collection mined conventional representations of Missouri in both local and national publications. The Writers Project American Guide Series was a series of guidebooks that featured essay on the state's history and culture, descriptions of its major cities, automobile tours of important attractions, and most importantly for our purposes, a portfolio of photographs. And here I'm showing you finds cutting and boring cord cob pipes and sawing cobs for corn cob pipes. You could also find very similar images in the National Geographic publication of the same year and Life magazine from a few years earlier. The Farm Security Administration's highly influential photography program created an extensive pictorial record of American life between 1935 and 1944. And here I'm showing you a comparison between Bear's livestock auction in Potosi and Russell Lee's auction sale in Missouri. And national publications. Here's Den's The Mississippi at Hannibal and Life on the Mississippi. And you can see that these are not only the same kind of sites, locations, and events, they are also the same perspective from the same viewpoint. And in fact, many of these images reflect, or many of the paintings reflect images that are in all of these different kinds of publications. So this is Smith's The Meeting of the Rivers, along with a postcard and a photograph from 1940. Here is this, finds Brew Kettles, a postcard put out by Anheuser-Busch, and apparently the postcard's reproduction in the WPA guide. Importantly, these visual legacies date back further. So for example, here we can see a painting of Shaw's Garden. And then we can also see a 1908 postcard and a photograph from an 1892 photographic picture book, essentially, of St. Louis. Here we have a painting of one of the Joplin mines, along with stereoscope cards, which is what I'm showing you here on the bottom. That was the late 19th century, early 20th century version of virtual reality, along with a postcard. Actually, here are two postcards. All of these sources, including the WPA guide, the mass market magazines, and even children's school books, agreed there was no one way to pinpoint a single Missouri type. And perhaps the most colorful articulations of this sentiment appeared in the 1941 WPA guide, and I'm going to read here. The spare Ozark hillman with his rabbit gun and dog is a Missourian. So is the weathered open country farmer, the prosperous cotton planter, the subsistence sharecropper with his stair-steps family, the drawling sawmill hand, the scientific orchardist reading his bulletins from the fruit experiment stations, the lead miner, the hustling small-town merchant, the Kansas City businessman, the St. Louis industrialist with one eye on Jefferson City and the other on Washington, the smiling filling station attendant who talks to everyone crossing the continent, the silent riverman who lives in a shanty boat and sees almost nobody. All are Missourians. Most of them say neither, some say nother, and a few in the fashionable residential sections affect the Atlantic seaboard's neither. The same sources argued that Missouri's topography and cultural diversity made it quintessentially American. The Fortune article's, The Fortune article's subtitle reinforced the link between the two. Part Northern, part Southern, part Eastern, part Western, and wholly American. Closer to home, this 1940s high school textbook of Missouri history forecast the sentiment of the Scruggs-Vandervoort-Barney collection. Its opening chapter was entitled, Missouri, Heart of the Nation. Its opening sentence read, "To know Missouri is to know our nation." And its first study exercise question underscored the point, tell why it is appropriate to call Missouri the heart of the nation. Although it was the diversity of Missouri that made it the heart of the nation, the collection visualized the cultural, physical, and spatial segregation that separated races, ethnicities, religions, classes, and genders. Look, for example, at Fred Shane's Missouri Musicians. The work pictures two Black musicians performing in a grove of trees surrounded by red brick buildings. Two additional Black men appear beside them, their bodies in motion. A white gentleman in a suit coat peers into the small circle, which is completed by a white farmer sitting on a short bench, us, the beholders of the painting in the foreground or the space that is set aside for us, and another white man holding a small child. This all-male scene juxtaposes Black musicians with white viewers, replicating the dynamics of minstrel shows that extended from the stage to the middle-class parlor through advertisements, toys, and sheet music. And here are just 3 examples. Although the popularity of the minstrel show declined rapidly in the 1870s, and only a few troupes remained by 1920, minstrel acts continued to be depicted in the cinema and on television well into the 1950s. Its songs, too, lived on. The Missouri Waltz was a minstrel song that was adapted by the Missouri's General Assembly with some amended lyrics as the official state song in 1949. And here I'm showing you sheet music, 3 covers of sheet music, the first from 1915, the second from 1926, and the third from the early 1940s. By most historians' accounts, the origin of the Missouri Waltz can be attributed to one of several different Black jazz pianists performing in Missouri railroad towns. By those same accounts, none of the musicians received any credit or royalties from it. While much music popularized during the American folk revival of the early 1940s was attributed to different cultural groups, including the Scotch-Irish, the French, and the German, those that descended from African Americans were simply appropriated. Not surprisingly, perhaps, the caption that accompanied the Missouri musicians in the original 1946 catalog states, quote, "The folk songs and folkways of the past have come down to us today to broaden our cultural heritage. Richest in the Ozark region, folk songs and dances are heard and seen in all parts of the state, even in the shadows of Missouri's State University." While scholars have debated whether the catalog is correct in locating the musicians at the University of Missouri, the assumption certainly makes sense and would have to its early 1940s viewers. Especially since the artist taught in the art department at the University of Missouri, and he depicted the university in another painting, which I'm showing you here. Moreover, the university was a predominantly white space. After Lloyd Gaines was denied admission to the University of Missouri Law School in 1936 because of his race, Gaines and the NAACP took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. 2 years later, the court ruled that Missouri had to provide Black Americans with equal educational opportunities within the state. The legislature replied by passing a law that expanded professional training schools at Lincoln University, the institution of higher education for Black students in Missouri. The issue had yet to be settled when Fortune magazine spotlighted the state in 1945. It noted, quote, "Missouri's determination to maintain educational segregation has been expensive." The university did not admit Black students until 5 years later, in 1950. The catalog's reference to the American folk revival of the early 1940s points to another theme in the collection, Missouri's folk culture. In southwest Missouri, outside Springfield, Schreiber painted Basket Maker in the Ozarks, Reed Springs. The work presents multiple steps in the weaving process. The harvested material, in this case, fine white oak slats, presumably from the local environment, the physical process of weaving, and the finished products. The rolling hillside, grazing horse, cultivated fields, and wood slat cabin create a sense of artistic creation that accompanies the simplicity of farm life. And there is truth to this painting. Farming families in the Ozarks wove baskets in their spare time for trade or sale to help the family finances. However, by the 1930s and 40s, basket makers focused on the tourist market. And that's what I'm showing you here. Visitors traveling on Highway 66 across Missouri could see Ozark-made baskets dangling from posts and clotheslines in front of general stores, post offices, and gas stations. And here I'm showing you members of the Wells family making baskets and their baskets for sale. Travel guides cited this area as Basketsville, and collectors returned again and again to select among the over 38 varieties of baskets. While some celebrated the folkways and the commerce they brought to the region, others expressed concern that Ozark culture painted the area in a far from progressive lens. In 1942, Springfield intended to host an Ozark Folk Festival to select representatives to compete at the National Folk Festival in St. Louis, Missouri. However, the Chamber of Commerce expressed ambivalence at best, and I'm showing you two different kind of publications from that time. One editorial cited a member of the Chamber of Commerce who declared, and I'm going to quote, "The hillbilly stuff should be eliminated. That a lot of freaks should not be selected to go to the National Festival as representatives of the Ozarks. Why call back the things we've been trying to forget for 50 years? Another critic asked, why advertise to the world that we are ignorant? Additional paintings from the region link folk culture to poverty, and most importantly, they almost always try to separate it from modern life. And note that work, again, we're looking at separate. We're looking at segregated spaces. Other paintings register diversity through segregation. While women are included in the collection, they are represented as wives, mothers, and importantly, consumers. Look, for example, at these two paintings, Peanut Stand Sedalia on the left and Canning and Button Art, State Fair Sedalia on the right. The former pictures a woman purchasing a treat for her child, while the latter pictures a woman discriminating among a variety of jars as her husband and son look on impatiently. Although women composed at least 30% of the workforce, the collection, along with contemporary advertisements and media imagery, depicted them as wives, mothers, and consumers rather than as workers and producers. And as a side note, I looked for a photograph of Mary Gamble, the department store's publicity manager who worked on this collection, and could not find a photograph of her. But I did find this, Gamble's participation in a career conference entitled Women's Place is Where? Basically. We see this in other ways. While Black Americans migrated to St. Louis and Kansas City between the wars, they are pictured outside urban areas and alongside waning occupations and industries. Look, for example, at the prosperous farm. While two European Americans are depicted at work in the middle group, one of the Black Americans in the foreground is depicted sleeping in the hay, a common stereotype for over a century. Look too at Martin's The Golden Eagle. A well-dressed African-American couple quietly watches the steamer as it passes by on the Missouri River. Although they are not far from St. Louis, as indicated by the Eads Bridge, they are at leisure and alone and outside the urban environment. Now, there are certain paintings that underscore the legislation as well as the cultural events that reinforced segregation. Here is Fred Conway's Grand and Olive, which depicts Grand Center, the bustling theater and entertainment district of St. Louis that attracted Midwestern tourists since the early 1900s, when the Princess Theater opened in 1912 as a vaudeville house. A number of other motion picture houses and vaudeville houses opened in the following years, including the Grand Central and the Empress. The Missouri Theater, the St. Louis Theater, and the Fox Theater, all of which opened to critical acclaim in the 1920s, are highlighted in the painting by their lighted signs. Their popularity enabled other theaters, popular restaurants, note the Piccadilly signs, nightclubs and ballrooms to open, making it the place to be in the 1930s and 40s. Conway's modernist style and use of bright, often garish colors creates a collage-like effect, enhancing the scene's energy and vitality and seeming to celebrate urban life. And while the background certainly is a celebration of Grand Central's nightlife, the foreground presents a very different story. The pole that holds the Grand and Olive Street signs includes the word "stop." A danger sign appears directly above a bucket with the word "city" emblazoned across it. A trash can sits at the center of the composition, and a troubling scene unfolds on the right. A young man with a long, sharp object lunges away from a woman who appears to be falling to the ground. And indeed, Conway's painting depicts a neighborhood in transition. The Grand Central closed in 1938 and was razed to make room for a parking lot a decade later. The Empress closed in 1955, and the Missouri Theater was demolished in the late 1950s. By the early 1950s, the area was almost deserted. The theater district decline was precipitated and exacerbated by changing demographics. Between 1940 and 1915, the city witnessed the largest relocation of white people to the suburbs. These two maps visualize the dramatic change. As the white population left the city and expanded into the suburbs, the Black population was forced into smaller and smaller areas. And this demographic shift was by no means natural. Historian Colin Gordon writes that the demographics of Greater St. Louis was bound up in a tangle of local, state, and federal policies that explicitly and decisively sorted the city's growing population by race. These policies yielded both an intense concentration of African American in certain wards or neighborhoods of St. Louis itself, and created a virtually unbreachable wall between the city and its suburbs. And here, just because I'm already beginning to critique my own point of view, you can see another painting from the collection that does a really nice job of pointing to this kind of white flight, as it became known, up on where this Victorian home is being, as you can see, destroyed and passed by modern technologies and transportation. But it's really important to note that it was not only rules and regulations that created and reinforced the segregation, it was also civic rituals. And here I'm showing you Tsukowski's Veiled Prophet Parade. By the late 1940s, the event was a St. Louis institution. In 1878, grain executive and former Confederate cavalryman Charles Slayback joined with other members of the St. Louis elite to form a secret society that blended the pomp and ritual of a New Orleans Mardi Gras with the symbolism from Irish poet Thomas Moore. They created the myth of the veiled prophet of Khorasan, a mystic traveler who decided to make St. Louis his base of operations. The first parade attracted over 50,000 spectators. Historian Thomas Spencer has argued that the elite staged the Veiled Prophet Parade to reclaim control of the city and to reinforce their power and socioeconomic values. The racial and class politics of their program was clearly articulated in the first Veiled Prophet, who is armed and hooded, much like members of the Ku Klux Klan. And here I'm showing you kind of an image of the first Veiled Prophet that appeared in an illustrated magazine and a photograph of Klan members in North Carolina. And these same figures appear in this 1892 photograph of the parade. Zukovsky's painting emphasizes the parade floats and the large crowd cheering from the sideline. The flag with the fleur-de-lis emphasizes the city's French roots and links to New Orleans through Mississippi River trade and traffic. It might also reference the 1946 queen who appeared in the float. She hailed from one of the oldest French families in the nation, whose impact was characterized as much by family connections and private enterprise and negotiation as it was by conquest and colonization. Mayfield, the department store's president, kept one of the paintings on loan after donating the rest to the University of Missouri. In it, a young Black child is taking a break from shining shoes to appreciate art, elevate his taste, and thereby enable his upward mobility. It quite literally represents the aims of grand emporiums: to socialize consumers into European American middle-class values and behaviors. The collection's picture of social stability, economic prosperity, cultural sophistication, and folk authenticity helped assert the department store's status as Missouri's tastemaker and appealed to middle-class consumers with cultural aspirations, as well as an automobile, leisure time, and the disposable income necessary to enjoy it. The artworks evoke an idealized and naturalized view of everyday life, and it is precisely this documentary character that conceals the social conflicts embedded within them. As I noted at the beginning of this talk, placemaking is the process of creating places that people want to live, work, and play. And certainly, it is undeniable that this collection aims to do exactly that, to create a picture of Missouri that people want to live in, they want to work in, they want to play in, and they want to visit, right? However, oftentimes when we think of creative placemaking today, that process is intimately tied to gentrification. There's a critic, Stephen Pritchard, puts it this way: people, communities, cultures already exist in places. They produce and reproduce their own social spaces. And here I think it's important to note that there are no pictures of indigenous and native peoples in this collection. Part of the reason for that is they had already been, even by the early 1840s, had already been pushed out of Missouri. So but the way in which those indigenous peoples are presented in the collection is all of the place names, including Missouri. So This placemaking, right, in this case, there's the absence of the people that initially inhabited that space. So the critic, when he says people, communities, and cultures already exist in places, that's really important. They produce and reproduce their own spaces. Urban change, creative placemaking as we call it today, he argues, is commonly dressed up with terms such as renaissance, regeneration, revitalization, and renewal, which in turn serve to disguise gentrification and the processes of dispossession and displacement that accompany it. So he suggests an alternative, which he calls place guarding, and he defines it this way. It puts people first, not place or property or profit. It puts the people who either already live in an area threatened by redevelopment first. If the Missouri Heart of the Nation collection is about place making, it seems clear to me that it is also about place guarding, and in this case, about protecting the carefully constructed public spaces that ensure the continuation of existing social, racial, class, and gendered hierarchies. And it returns There we go. And it returns me to the theme for this year's symposium. Because Out of This World might seem diametrically opposed to my interest in place and placemaking and place guarding. However, I really want to unpack 2 sentences of the description. We'll dig into the modern and historical marvels that learn about our world by looking beyond it and deep within it. We'll ponder the limitlessness of our own minds and creativity and reach for what comes next. So first of all, I really love this because we began the symposium with a talk about the sun, right? Like a big picture, and here we've gone deep within it. So we've gone beyond and deep. And we'll ponder the limitlessness of our own minds and creativity. I think this collection actually, interestingly, points us to attend to the limited quality, sometimes, the limitedness of our minds. That in this case, this collection was intended to do a lot of great things. And indeed it has, and it continues to do that. But does it speak to a particular audience? Yes. Does it naturalize that view and make it appear as if it was always there? Yes. Have we seen that as scholars and historians? No. So this is where it's really important, right, to recognize not only what's out there, but also what we have to learn and how we need to look at the world differently. And it seems like this takes us back to the opening comments about the sublime. If you remember in that first presentation, Derek talked about the importance of the sublime as a kind of an aesthetic that shakes you, that causes you to look at the world differently and never in the same way again. Sometimes we have to do that labor. And that's a labor that I'm still working on with this collection because, to be quite honest, individual paintings in this collection don't fit the image, even the one I ended with. That I've always been uncomfortable ending this talk or ending my thoughts on this painting because this artist was actually very attuned to class and racial difference in the United States. And his representations of Black Americans do not have the same stereotypical attributes that so many of the era do. However, it's clear to me that for Mayfield, this painting served to reinforce his sense of the world. At the same time, and he is struggling to maintain it. So in this very year in 1946, a group of women, both black and white, started basically doing lunch counter sit-ins at all of these department store luncheon spaces to counter the racism that did not allow them into those spaces. So this is a moment at which Mayfield is working to maintain a particularly segregated view of the world. So this painting is doing work for him. But as I said, it doesn't quite work with the artist. And we see that even more so because he has another picture, this one, which is it's basically the same idea. It's a young child looking at art. So he's clearly in this world, right, also thinking about this is the role of art. This is what it does for all people, all children, right? And then he also creates a version of this for the Associated American Artists in 1946 at the same time. So not to recognize that the individual paintings can do work is a problem. Not recognizing that all of these artists have very different political commitments is a problem. And yet, not talking about the work it does as a whole, I think is also a problem. And what's very disconcerting to me as an art historian is that many of these paintings were working against the world that they claimed they wanted to create. Art has the power to do that. It has the power both to shake us up as well as to kind of reinforce and give us further evidence to believe what we want to believe in. And I think what undergraduate institutions like this one that are committed to interdisciplinary work, that are committed to questions, are really important because they push our limited minds into that space, right? They do exactly the kind of work this symposium is trying to do, and what this university is trying to do with the humanities. So I'd be more than happy to have people give me ideas and suggestions about what I should do with all of this, all this stuff, or add to my collection of the paraphernalia that I have in the car. But to really think about the fact that your education is offering a way to that creative, limitless, those spaces that you're working to create and contribute to. So thank you very much for listening.
All right, let's see if this works. Excellent. I'm getting some sound. Do we have any questions? Anybody? All right, fantastic.
Hi, so I'm very interested on your thoughts as an art historian on the increase of AI-created art that's being spread.
I think I'm like many people who are still perplexed by AI. And I haven't played with it enough to know what it can and should do. My sense is that it will be able to do, we know what it does well, right? It creates patterns. What it can't do is specificity. What it can't do is kind of the messaging. At this point, at least from my understanding. So I have no idea. But I will say this, it comes down to what I generally think, that if you're going to use a tool, you just have to acknowledge the tool. It doesn't mean that what comes out of it won't be good or won't be relevant. I could imagine entire exhibitions of AI art, right? I could imagine putting an AI painting next to another painting and having people ask really important questions about where is human creativity, right? What does art do? So I can imagine all sorts of ways in which AI-generated art can really force us to ask big questions. It's when that AI isn't acknowledged as part of the conversation, because that's just what we do as scholars and as responsible citizens, right? This is what Sally was talking about the other day when talking about disinformation, right? If we acknowledge our sources, if we root the stuff, right, we're going to be more responsible for it. We also make people more responsible. And that's sort of what I find with this collection, is that I struggle to know who I should make responsible. Is it the viewer? Is it the art object? Or is it the patron? Right? Or is it just the ways of knowing, the kind of worldviews that were present at the time? I'm looking to root responsibility, find responsibility. So with the AI, I would say that's exactly it. That if, I mean, I think it's a great parlor trick, right? To be able to confuse people with AI, But I think that it can also be used to ask really great questions, and to acknowledge, I think we just have to acknowledge where we get information. So, yeah, I would just have them cite it, just AI. Just like you do, actually, just like what you're supposed to do in your papers, right? If you use AI, you're supposed to write, this is the prompt, this is the generator I used, right? It's a footnote. And did you change it much, right? Those are all the requirements for kind of responsible creating.
Any other questions? I'll give you a second because I have a question. I'm really interested in the kind of relationship of art production to corporate entities. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm really interested in with this particular collection is in modern discourse on artistic production that is funded by corporate entities. There's a lot of concern about attribution and about whether or not artists are given credit for their work and how those things function. And I'm really curious as to how, in this moment, so in the kind of earlier part of the 20th century, mm-hmm. how credit was given, if it was given, and the ways that even artists' identities were being utilized or engaged with mm-hmm. In the collection.
That's a great question, because at this historical moment, first of all, we have a lot of these same artists are also doing advertisements. So Lucky Strike was a cigarette company. It purposely hired many of these artists, like Thomas Hart Benton, for artwork that appeared in their advertisements, and Benton was given credit because part of the reason that he was asked was for his name recognition, right, and for the value that was attributed to his style of art and its relationship to the working people. So in a way, it was precisely the artist's identity that helped sell it, and because companies were looking for that, most of these companies were recovering from the Depression and needed to regain kind of a sense of trustworthiness. So looking to fine art helped them. So they were definitely, most of these artists were continually given recognition for this. Now, Benton realized relatively early, and many of you might be familiar with Thomas Hart Benton. He's just a curmudgeon. But he realized pretty early he thought he could use these as opportunities, advertisements as opportunities to get art to people and to raise the kind of questions he did in his artwork. He realized with Lucky Strike that wasn't going to happen at some point. So the artists really struggled with that balance, but they all did it. Georgia O'Keeffe has some stunning advertisements for Dole Pineapple. We can talk about how troubling that can be. So in this case, they were given credit. Now that said, if you look at all the textbooks from this era, you'll see that they'll include paintings from the 19th century there's no artist indicated. You don't even know where it comes from. So we're entering that world of copyright.
Anybody come up with a question? No?
Entering might be the wrong word.
All right. Well,
Okay.
please join me in thanking Dr. Kristin Schwain again for her excellent talk. And this is the final presentation of the symposium this year. I'd like to thank the whole symposium committee, but most importantly, Derek Glasgow, who did an amazing job at the last minute coming in and making this thing happen. He did incredible work. I'm also here to remind you that there are a bunch of activities this afternoon, specifically around service. First and foremost, there is voter registration at Backer Dining Hall that is coming up here in a couple of minutes. And then at 11 o'clock, I know a bunch of you have signed up for service activities. Some of you will want to go to, I think most of you will want to go to Miller to get set up and connect with the appropriate people to go to the locations where you're doing that service. Other than that, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a fantastic